All right, now we are ready to start stamping our card and assembling it. So the very first thing I'm going to do is create this frame on the front. Oh, I left my tape on my machine. So same as before, I'm going to center it between the top and the bottom, and then I'm going to center it between the sides. Now this piece is 5 1/4 by 4 inches, so it's 1/4 of an inch smaller than the front of the card, and that's so we have that white frame around it. There we go. I could take that out of there later. So now we have our frame there, and this is the stamp that we're going to do for our tree. So it's a color layer stamp, so you layer all the colors to create this image. So I've got my stamp here. I'm going to put it on my block. I like to use grid blocks or blocks with lines when I'm doing sentiments, so that I can help, it just helps, those lines help to make sure that things are straight. You can use them to line up with the edges of the card, and I just find it very helpful. So that there is done. It is a pigment ink, so I am going to heat set it just so that it doesn't smear. Pigment ink tends to stay wet for a little while, so I want to make sure that it's not going to smear, so I'm going to heat set it. The other alternative to this would be to emboss it, but I chose not to for this card. So usually just a few seconds is good for heat setting. There's not really a certain time, and there's not really a way to tell that it's heat set. So I just usually do it for a few seconds. I want to say maybe 10-15 seconds, and then I set it aside to dry. So I'm using a liquid adhesive to glue that frame onto the front of the card so that I can move it around and get it in place properly. And when I do that, I try not to touch that sentiment. I just don't want to smudge it if it's not completely heat set yet. But I'm going to set that to the side. I'm going to put an acrylic block on it to hold it down for me while we're working on the image part of this. So I can leave that on top of there. So for stamping the image, I am using my stamp positioner. I'm going to just have it lined up in the corner. The very first stamp I want to use is the solid Christmas tree. There we go. And it is going to stick to the paper, so I'm just gonna put that right back in the corner. So when I ink a stamp in here, I like to rub the ink on there first just to make sure that there's ink over the whole thing, and then I tap it. I don't want to leave any smears or marks or anything. And if you just rub the ink on it and then stamp it, you tend to get little smears and streaks on it. So it is going to be blotchy. If that bothers you, you can do a second stamp. It does tend to even out a little bit as it dries, but because this is a tree and it's not completely even looking, I kind of like the blotchy look to it. So the next one is this one here. Now, when you have one of these sets, if you ever don't know exactly which one's next, if you turn the package over, it shows you. So it's a great way to see what which order they go. Sorry, I lost what I was saying in a minute there. All right, so I had this in the corner as I was lining it up. It stuck to the cardstock again, but that's okay. So this one here is not going to be a solid tree. It just has a little bit of the branch detail, and I'm using a ink that's just a little bit darker green. Perfect. Now I can put that one away. And then which one is next? I always have to look at them to see which is next. So the next one here, we're going to line it up, and then it's going to be just a little bit darker green. And these stamps are perfect for people that don't like to color, because basically you're stamping your color in. There we go. So our image is stamped. Now there's one last layer for this tree. And what I am going to do is I am going to stamp it and emboss it in gold. Another option, so for this one I stamped it and embossed it with gold. Another option would be to stamp it and emboss it with white, and as if it was snow falling down, but I thought it looked kind of cool as tinsel on the tree. And then there's also a little star here. I'm going to stamp this at the same time. I'm going to emboss that with gold. The one thing I want to do though before I emboss it is I want to heat set the inks on my paper here. So the inks that are used, they have resins in them, and if I were to just stamp and emboss, the embossing powder would stick to the entire image. So I need to heat set them so that the powder only sticks to the ink that I'm using when I'm going to emboss. So once again, I usually only do a few seconds, but just to make sure, I'm going to use an embossing buddy just to make sure that if there's any moisture in those inks, the powder from this is going to help that not to stick. Now, one way to double check would be to take your stamped image, and do this before you stamp any details that you want to emboss. If anything sticks, you know that that's still wet and you still need to heat set it or use your embossing buddy again. If nothing sticks, you're good to go. So this goes back in the container. I'm going to use that again in just a moment. And you'll see my paper is warped, and that just happens when using the heat gun. The paper tends to do that, but once we go and glue it onto our card, it's not going to be an issue. So I'm going to stamp. And I'm using a Versamark ink here, which is a sticky ink, so that embossing powder is going to stick to that ink. Make sure it has some really good contact there with the paper. And that powder should just be sticking to the ink that you were using to hold the embossing powder down. So I'm going to take my heat tool and I'm going to melt the powder on there. And there we have our image there completely embossed. This can go back in the package. Put the lid back on this, and I did spill some when I put it back, but I will clean that up in a moment.